I'd be lying if I said that there wasn't a number of times that I found myself really discouraged and disappointed about not just the decisions that were made, but how they were made. And it felt at times a little bit like we had been betrayed. But then as time's passed and I've spent more time looking back on it, there was some decision making that Texas and certainly Oklahoma most recently made that maybe if I were in their shoes, I would have had to think about and consider. I continue to maintain that the choice Texas made wasn't a financial one because we all know what Texas resources are like. I think theirs was more about affiliating with a group of schools that on a given Saturday they would rather get beat by Alabama than they would Kansas State or Florida than Iowa State. Or, that I think was really what was driving the way they looked out down the road. And in Oklahoma's case, I'm not as convinced that that was the issue for them. I think they were more of what I would call the reluctant bride that kind of felt like, wow, if we don't go, what happens to the Texas OU football game, basketball, all the things that we know from an OU and Texas standpoint are really important. So I kind of felt like if I was in Oklahoma's case, it would have been hard for me not to think about the long term and don't we want to be affiliated with Texas and now these other schools? I think time will tell, but you look at Missouri, it's hard to really say that they've benefited from a competitive standpoint. Nebraska, I don't know that you could make the argument that they've benefited from a competitive. They probably have both benefited financially, but Colorado, clearly they haven't benefited from the Pac-12. A&M may be the one school that probably could make the best argument about they've benefited from it, but the motivation they had to leave was exclusively about getting away from Texas, and now here they are in a year right back in the same situation. So that's a long way of saying, the past has it's ebbed and flowed for me in terms of how I look at it. But going forward, I think, I'd be shocked if we don't add additional members at some point in the future. And I don't think it's as much about whether it's 2 more, 4 more, 6 more, 1 more. I think it's really going to be driven more by what schools are available. And if they can really benefit us from a TV contract standpoint to where we can get an additional pro rata share because of that particular school joining, I think that's going to be part of it. I think there is some desire to look west and try and recognize that you've got a BYU now that maybe it makes some sense for us to have a travel partner in or around that location. So if I were betting, I would tell you I think it's more likely than not that we'll add additional schools in the future.
What are your thoughts, Tim, on basketball-only schools as well? And like a Gonzaga, I don't want to get you to name schools individually, but I'm thinking like a Gonzaga, UConn, potentially that have been basketball powers and maybe their value that they might bring to a league that maybe has been understated in college athletics?
Yeah, so, the first thing I would tell you is, the one thing that I don't think we're lacking for in this league is good basketball. I think we've got the best basketball of any conference. Now, does that mean you shouldn't consider adding and getting even stronger? No. I think you probably should think about those things. But the way to this point, the TV contracts have always viewed football and basketball is for every dollar that they provide a conference, they've typically suggested 75 cents of it is driven by football. So to add somebody with basketball only from that standpoint may not make a lot of sense. Now, maybe the mistake we've been making all these years is having a negotiation that includes football and basketball. And perhaps the time's come where we say, hey, when we renew our contract in 7 years, 5 years, we're going to separate the football out from the basketball because we think basketball should be 50 cents of the dollar as opposed to 25. Then maybe it does make sense to do that. But the problem with any school like a Gonzaga, if it was just basketball, I suppose you could make some financial sense to that, men's and women's basketball, but that's not what those schools are looking for. They want all their other sports to join too, and then the existing schools are saying, wow, flying my baseball team, softball team, volleyball team, whatever it might be, all that way and miss that much class time and spend that much money, and it gets to be hard to make sense of it.
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to ask about, I mean, the way things have been kind of pitted in the media, it's like this Big 12 versus Pac-12 sort of adversarial relationship. What is that like actually behind closed doors within the league?
Yeah, it's funny because it felt like for the past 3 or 4 years, it was always about the Big 12 being sort of, are they going to make it? Are they going to survive? What are they doing? What's happening? And in the matter of, it seems like months, the narrative has flipped so much to the Pac-12. What are they doing? Are they going to survive? Our school's going to. So, there's a part of us that lived through when we were in the barrel going, it's kind of nice to have another conference try and defend themselves on all fronts. In terms of, how it feels day to day in our office, I got to tell you, the ADs that I'm friends with in the Pac-12, I don't know that any of them are necessarily feeling like it's our attempt to undermine what they're doing. I think it's more about recognizing that if something happens out there and there's a decision that they no longer feel like it makes sense to associate with that group of schools financially, geographically, that here's an option that is worth thinking about and considering. And so that's how I think most of the time the conversations have been going. I can't speak to what Brett and George, the two commissioners, may have shared over the past year, but clearly they're in a different spot than the Pac-12 has been in a long time, and trying to understand what their new TV media rights deal seems to be one of the great secrets of college athletics right now. Nobody seems to know exactly what they do or don't have. What I tell people is I just know that if we had something really good to talk about from a media rights standpoint, we'd be screaming it at the top of every mountain we could find. And sometimes that silence suggests the opposite. So I think it'll be interesting to see when media days take place, how that plays out and exactly what happens there in terms of their announcements.
Yeah, I've got just one more. Now, this has been great. I love talking conference realignment here, and I do want to get to K-State. But the last thing I would ask is just, everyone's chasing the Big Ten and the SEC financially right now, and I know Brett just said at the podium we don't want to think about trying to compete with other conferences. But what do you guys view as a realistic kind of financial ceiling in terms of a payout for each team, or how close you could get to that number, or just how that's going to shake out?
Boy, financial ceiling. I'm not sure there is such a thing. In my 40 years in this profession, it has never been about pulling back on revenues. There have been times where we've had to pull back on expenses, but it's always been about spending more, building more, paying more, and now when you throw in the NIL piece, I just think it's going to continue to go. I'm trying to remember what we were getting from the Big 12 when I was at Kansas State. I want to say it was in the 8 to 10 million a year.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And so look at, that's 15 years ago. Here we are distributing in the 40s, and what the SEC and the Big Ten are spending or distributing is even more. I'm not sure. It's going to be hard for anybody to catch up to the Big Ten and the SEC. There's just so many advantages they have in terms of eyeballs and competitive success and network opportunities. I think it'll be difficult, but that doesn't mean we still can't be in a good place. If it was always about who spends the most money, Texas should be winning championships in every sport, and they don't, because it's more than just about money. So I think that's why you see the K-States and the TCU. Those are the stories that I really enjoy, and that's probably why I enjoyed my time at Kansas State, because it was, we all knew what our resources were and weren't, but man, that didn't keep our kids from wanting to compete and our coaches from working hard. And when you had that success and got those championships, it seemed all the more special.